Excellent. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed and wonderful panel to you. From my far right, Christina Lamb, Chief Foreign Correspondent, Sunday Times, and a best-selling author, and her books are on sale in the back. So if you would like to buy any of her books, including her most recent book, which was launched just last week, it is for sale.
Thank you for the plug.
I beg your pardon?
Thank you for the plug.
That's what we do. I mean, books that are good for the world, we plug them shamelessly. Then Shukria Barakzai, an Afghan politician, a journalist, a prominent Muslim feminist, and a former ambassador of Afghanistan to Norway. Welcome. And then Mary-Ellen McGroarty, who is joining us on screen, who is representative and country director for the World Food Programme for Afghanistan. So a really, really wonderful group. And what I propose to try and do today is try and have a little bit of an analysis as to how we got here. Because humanitarian crises don't just arise like a vortex from nowhere. They come from a deep context, and a lot of things have to go badly wrong for people to be facing starvation on a mass scale. And unfortunately, that is something that obtains today in Afghanistan. So I'm actually going to start with Christina, sort of an outsider-insider perspective, and then I'm going to come to an insider-insider perspective. But I'm going to ask you both a version of the same question, which is a big question, which is, it's 2022. The Taliban are back in power in Afghanistan. How did that happen?
Thank you. You mean, how did we spend 20 years spending $2 trillion and losing, well, more than 100,000 Afghan lives and about 5,000 NATO fighters just to get the Taliban back in power again? Yeah, it's quite a complicated question because there were so many things that were done wrong. But I guess right from the start, I was there just after the Taliban was toppled in December of 2001. And straight away, lots of foreign aid and foreign officials and various people came to help Afghanistan. And it seemed to me that nobody really talked much to the Afghans about what they wanted. It was all top down of things that needed to be done. And I mean, one example which is very close to my heart is that there was an awful lot of discussion about women's rights, and now that the Taliban had gone, that women would be free again. And so people came and set up gender awareness projects. Nobody talked to the men. It seems to me that you can do as much as you want to make women aware of their rights, but if you don't actually change the male mindset, then that is not really going to be very effective. So, but that's just one example. And we focused very quickly on having elections, and not a single Afghan I met in all the weeks and months I was there early on ever said to me, what we really need is an election. People wanted security and jobs and food. And we spent a lot of money sending foreign advisors rather than training Afghans to do the jobs. Because I think one of the questions that we'll probably get onto is how come, not just that the Taliban have taken over, but the whole system has sort of collapsed overnight. If we'd spent all that money creating a sustainable system, surely the hospitals and things would be still working and wouldn't be in the state that they are now. So our priorities, I think, were wrong. We then had a series of governments, first the Karzai government, then more recently the Ghani government, which I found traveling around, many of the people I spoke to said to me that the biggest problem in their lives were the government, that there was so much corruption, that to do anything to get a driving license, to lots of people have legal cases because Afghanistan's been at war for so many years, more than 40 years, that lots of people's property have been taken by different people and it's not clear who owns what. And to lodge any kind of legal claim, you had to bribe lots of people. And so people kept complaining that this government was the biggest problem in their lives. And yet that was the government that British forces, American forces, NATO forces were there trying to prop up. So that was very complicated. Then there were many other things like failing to respect the local culture and I don't know, I wrote a whole book like that size about all the problems that went wrong. But I mean, you know, many things, sadly, because I think people started out with good intentions. And sadly, many things were done wrong, and I hope that lessons are learned from it.
So Shukria, you were in the heart of you represented the government for a while, so you had access to the highest levels of power, and you witnessed both the things that went right and went wrong. What's your take on that question?
Thank you. It's sad, because if I close my eyes and remember the greatest time of my country, it's my childhood. What was right, what was wrong? As a generation, I'm 50 years old. I don't know. We never choose to go for war. We never have the right to bring a peace. It's really sad for a country with a great history. When it comes to representing the government, before I represent the government, I was elected member of parliament 2 times. I was representing the people of Afghanistan. And still, I believe I have the power, in fact, legitimacy to represent the people of Afghanistan. Because 9/11 happened, nobody have any idea about the culture, history, people, and complicity of the political region in the country, in Afghanistan. So they just came with the big messages, with the great slogans, with the lots of promises, starting from winning heart and minds of the Afghan people by US President, till sending hundreds of thousands of troops and war against terror. I myself, I joined the crowd, not by unwantedly, because I was being suffered during the Civil War, I was being suffered during the first Taliban, where at that time I was underground school teacher. I created, and I was the founder of home schools at that time. I had the honor to draft new constitution for my country, and that was not something I represent the government. That was something I represent the people of Afghanistan. But unfortunately, lack of understanding from donors' country and the complicity of Afghan politics in corruption, particularly political corruption, was the failure of our effort. I understand. If you go and talk with those mothers, even UK, in US, and any other country, which is they lost their children in Afghanistan, if you ask them why, they should feel proud because they open a door of opportunity for millions of people, which is they never was allowed to make their voices. So this is something we lost at the moment. We don't have it back. But when it comes to criticism, I equally criticize the international community in general. All international bodies, they never take serious the issue of extremism in the region. The 22 terrorist network groups, where still they're active. The complicity of proxy war in Afghanistan. How we could say, the society, the dilemma of the society and the culture of Afghans. So these things was been missing from the entire international agenda for the peace process, why we are today in this situation. What do you think? If you sideline a nation from a peace process, which is, I believe it was more project rather than process. If you sideline the women of Afghanistan, if you sideline the academia, researchers, from the entire peace process and just going one direction by representative of the special envoy from United States, Dr. Zalmay Khalilzad, which is, I do have respect for him. But today failures was his failure. And nobody's asking their own government, for God's sake, why you club Taliban while they're signing Doha Agreement, the most shameful agreement in the history of 21st century. Because a very powerful country with the name of United States of America, they signed an agreement with the most criminal network with the name of Taliban, and they take over the power. What they are doing today is the result and the consequence of Doha Agreement, which is we women in Afghanistan, we the people of Afghanistan, we are the one, we are paying the price. No one else. We are paying the price by our blood. We are paying the price by our generation. We're also human. There's nothing different between me, you, and others. But we are suffered because we've been betrayed, because we trust the wrong partners, because they say everything will be a political process, which is at the end, nothing comes out as a political process. Taliban took over militarily, and after it's 10 months, in one day. I'm counting days. The girls are not going to school. The women are not allowed to go for work. Even the domestic violence is rapidly increased. Everybody's talking just about the humanitarian crisis. They're blind to see other crises. We just came out with a political crisis, came out with the wrong decision, with the great mistakes. So right now, even right now, there are some countries are trying to wash white the Taliban. To say, oh, they change, oh, they will respect this, oh, the schools. Okay, if tomorrow they will open the schools, everything will be done? No. The nature of terrorist groups and network or military groups, which is they are fighting for no reason, they killed thousands of Afghans, innocent children. They attacked on schools, universities, hospitals. They never show a sign of humanity. But we picked them and we believe right now they are representing the great nation of Afghans. No, that's not the truth. If anyone, yes, they are the de facto authority. Right now, my land, my beloved homeland, my country is the hand of that terrorist group, and they are not the only terrorist group.
So the dilemma that we have, and we'll dig into some of the causal factors, is we have a body that may not be a legitimate or representative government, but it exercises authority. And Mary-Ellen, from the perspective of the World Food Programme, whose primary goal it is to deal with the unfolding humanitarian crisis, you have to, in some ways, treat this government in some ways as an interlocutor. But before we get into that, can you just give us some of the bare facts about the situation? Tell us about the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis and how bad it really is.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everyone. And I'm really sorry I'm not there with you in person. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm a relatively newcomer to Afghanistan, having arrived only in October 2020, and witnessed the transition in August last year. And just yesterday, if you're watching your calendars, it was 10 months in yesterday, on the 15th of June. And what we saw just unfold before our eyes from August onwards was at a scale I have never seen before in my career in WFP. Going into the winter, over 23 million people acutely food insecure, basically not being able to put food on the table every single day. And we saw the situation throughout the winter, and thankfully to the incredible generosity of the international community who heard us when we were calling for assistance, we were able to scale up the humanitarian operation across the winter and pull people back from just the precipice of the catastrophe. But they are not out of the woods yet in Afghanistan. The dial has not moved on the key drivers of food insecurity in Afghanistan, and that being the drought. We are coming into the harvest. We've had to tailor our optimism around the harvest. The snow has not been as good, the rain has not been as good, temperatures have been much higher. Also, many people have already mortgaged the harvest because they have borrowed to be able to eat across the winter. And then, of course, the impact of Ukraine in terms of the prices of seeds and fertilizers. So also the economy. The economy, as you all know, has imploded. Afghanistan was a very much an aid-dependent economy. After August, when overseas assistance stopped, development support stopped, the freezing of overseas assets, that liquidity crisis, it ruptured the entire economy. Jobs in the formal sector, the informal sector have been lost. The World Bank estimates that the economy has contracted by 30% since August. That's devastating. The middle class has been ruptured. Many of those people that left on the planes were part of the middle class in Afghanistan. And with that, the economy that was beneath that middle class is also ruptured. And no matter where I go across Afghanistan, whether it's to the Wahan corridor, whether it's to Kandahar, whether it's to Herat, I hear about the collision of the collision of the economic crisis, the collision of COVID, the collision of the drought, on top of, the legacy of many years of conflict. And of course now for many of the women, and of course for the girls, they are suffering the most because many of the women in Afghanistan are the breadwinners, they are the heads of their households, and they are suffering also right across the country and not being able to go to work. Over.
So if you just go through that list, droughts, food prices from Ukraine, shrinking economy, disappearance of middle class, disappearance of aid, the freezing of assets, COVID, the history of conflict, it's almost like an extraordinary concatenation of woes to all hit one country in one way. Just one of these would be bad for some countries. This combination is just absolutely woeful. So I guess I want to ask from where you sit, and I appreciate that your job is to be very pragmatic, to figure out how you can deliver the largest amount of aid to the largest amount of people in desperate need. How do you figure out engaging with the governments, and how do you figure out the obvious dilemmas involved in dealing with this particular government as opposed to one that's has greater legitimacy and is less problematic from a human rights and other perspective?
To be quite frank with you, there are days your head could bust. Just to put it, as a woman, I'm a woman myself, and I'm in a country where girls over the age of 11 or 12 can't go to school, and it's absolutely desperate. And every single day, I speak to women and I speak to young girls who are dealing with the trauma of that. Our national staff, their daughters are at home screaming at them being school. But, I have to somehow get over that, and I don't forget it. I have to somehow figure it out in my head to get over it, because at the end of the day, we have to deliver humanitarian assistance and try and save lives in Afghanistan. So my engagement with the de facto authorities, with the Taliban leadership, is based on pragmatism, but it's also based on the humanitarian principles. I do invoke, my Irishness to some extent. I come from a country that did know not so long ago incredible poverty, and not that long ago either, the scourges of famine. I also invoke the fact that I was there on August the 15th, you know, I mean, and representing the UN, and we did stay during the transition. I get a very mixed. It's very mixed engagement. You know, some of them are much I'm not going to say easier, more easier to deal with than others. But I mean, from where I sit and what I have to do, I try to maintain a very strong, robust approach on around the humanitarian principles. But when I do get the chances as well, I do, because I'm a woman myself. I bring up the issues of girls' education. I bring up the issues of women working, because a country will not come out of humanitarian needs. It will not come out of poverty unless, all of its population have the opportunity to be able to go to work equally and to get educated.
So Christina and Shukria, I'm going to ask you different versions of the same question, but you, Christina, have covered conflicts across the world, and you've often had to think about how we put pressure on, expose, write about the conduct of odious regimes. And you do that in order to have those regimes shunned or isolated or cause them to change their behavior. How do you think of it from one degree of remove? On the one hand, trying to criticize, shun, and isolate an odious regime. On the other hand, having to collaborate with it in order to save lives.
So this is very problematic, and I think that what the international community has done since the Taliban took over is punish the people of Afghanistan because they don't like the government that's in power. Now, I'm not saying, of course, I don't like the Taliban being in power, but they're a reality, and if you're going to actually get food to people and start the economy up again, you're going to have to deal with them. But there are ways to do it, and I'm sure Mary-Ellen can talk to us about what they're doing. There are ways of doing it that doesn't involve, you need permissions and things to import things, so you can't completely do things without involving the Taliban, but you can do things in a way that the money is not going to them, that you're in charge of that your officials on the ground, your workers are actually distributing things. So, but it's, a very delicate sort of dance at the moment that people are having to engage in.
So Shukria, two specific questions. One is the freezing or the halting of development assistance that has occurred in some instances. Not all of it, obviously, as Mary-Ellen indicates, but that's definitely happened in some circumstances. And secondly, the freezing of assets in the central bank. Do you think that those two things are justified in the current circumstances?
Well, the assets been freezed. It's not belong to the Taliban. Not at all. That's the assets of people of Afghanistan. And it will be the most injustice if we go and give part of the assets for the victims of 9/11, where the people of Afghanistan was not been engaged at all, or give the money to the hands of terrorist groups. I think those international organizations where they are working in Afghanistan and they're active, they are witness of the abusing of humanitarian aids also in Afghanistan by Taliban. The distribution are not equal. They are trying to distribute it to their own allies or people fighting for them. Part of that was been giving as a salary, not as a money, but I'm sure WFP will have the facts and figures. Because it comes on the local media and news, that Taliban are giving the wheat instead of salary for their fighters and soldiers. I do understand the humanitarian crisis very well. It's a shame for us that after 20 years of trillions of dollars in building human capacities and being engaged, still we are trying to look Afghanistan as a poorest country, at least in the Asia. And we are trying to deliver humanitarian assistance there, despite of how rich is this country themselves, minings and lots of others, which is Taliban de facto already been signed a large number of agreements with Chinese. It's very illegal because they are not a legal authority to do that. How we can deal with the humanitarian crisis? The only weapon we can use against the Taliban is to pressurizing them. Those humanitarian aid needs to be under some condition and circumstances. Conditionality should be the first, because if we like or not, Taliban are the beneficiary of that aids. They are receiving cash every single week. It's not like they are broken. No, they are in a very good shape. They are not distributing that money back to the people. So there should be a third body to monitor the international aid, including the conditions which is those aid should reach to the people of Afghanistan and under certain circumstances that the girls' education, the political settlement, the security, the independent judiciary system, the freedom of expression, even the safety of those humanitarian organizations needs to be considered as a priority, which is right now, every single day the target killing is going on. Today I read about one report that may be soon come with The Guardian or somewhere. They may publish more than thousands people are been missing in Afghanistan since Taliban took over the power. More than 182 women are been missing because Taliban de facto didn't accept that, yes, they are with us in a prison or something. So these things need to be considered. And when it comes to the crisis, would you believe supporting, sending assets, giving money to a terrorist group, will they give that back to the people? The one that they are stopping women and men going out from their houses, the one that they're ordering women and ordering their husbands, if they went or did something wrong, you will be the one to be punished. Will you believe them to have the authority and take decision on behalf of international organizations or on behalf of the people or the money? I think that would be another bad and worse chapter that we are trying to open by any name. I know there's a good appetite from particularly certain groups that they are trying to ask for those assets, and they are bringing the issue of humanitarian crisis on top. First, those assets are not for humanitarian. Those assets should go for the Afghanistan infrastructures, because that's the public money.
I think there was a misunderstanding at the beginning. There was a feeling that the international community would have a lot of leverage with the Taliban because the Taliban needed aid because Afghanistan was in such a precarious situation. I think what we've seen in the last 10 months, particularly in the last few months, as more and more restrictions have been imposed by the Taliban, particularly on women, that actually the Taliban don't care about that. They don't care if people are starving. And, you know, this is an organization where many of their fighters have lived on a piece of bread a day for years fighting in the mountains, and they kind of think, you know, people should be able to get on with it. So the international community is finding it it just doesn't have leverage with the Taliban, so that you're not in a great negotiating position. Basically, I mean, either you say, all right, we're cutting off everything, and then, you know, frankly, people are starving to death already. Far more people will starve. Or you somehow find a way of working with them, which I think is what Mary-Ellen and some of the organisations are doing. I'm not sure adding another organisation, which you're suggesting, to monitor is really the answer, because one of the problems in Afghanistan has been in the past that there have been too many layers, and that those things start delaying things and maybe sidelining some of the resources.
Mary-Ellen, I want to come to you just on the idea that a portion of this money lands up propping up the regime. And that, I guess there are two variants of that. One is some of it goes directly into the pockets of civil servants and functionaries, and some of them may be necessary to deliver this, so that may be legitimate, but some of it could be siphoned off to kind of prop up the regime. But the more subtle argument is the more you avert a humanitarian crisis, the more you sustain the political legitimacy of an odious regime. Both of those are problems, and they're different kinds of problems, but it would be very helpful for you to help us think through both of those.
Yeah, thanks. That's the dilemma. I mean, you could say, you know, the fact that we are there is a political statement in itself, right? You know what I mean? I don't agree with conditioning assistance. So I don't. And I mean, and I remember way back in August and September, you know, these discussions were being had, and I mean, as we watched the situation implode, right? You know, who's going to make to take that decision, right? That you stop, right? And then you watch children become malnourished, you watch children die, right? And it becomes, then you have collective punishment. You know, we deliver assistance. We are not, no resources are at the moment, you know, really are going to the government of Afghan, you know, the de facto authorities, or even the civil service, you know what I mean? Because we don't have, I mean, all the aid is being channeled in through UN organizations, through NGOs, and that's what we work with directly, and working directly with communities. So at the moment, and this is, you know, and this is where, when you're sitting where I am in Afghanistan, and you're looking at, because some of the things over the last 20 years, yes, it was certainly not perfect, but institutions and stuff were built up, right? Do we want to see all that collapsing? You know, a lot of work was done. Let's take some of the key stresses of Afghanistan. Climate change, for example. The work that was done around climate change, agriculture, food systems, nutrition, health. Far from perfect, but some progress. And I think when we talk about engagement, we have to start thinking about that just beyond, you know, how do we get off this humanitarian peak? You know, so that's one way. And then I guess on the other question, I think, Paul, the second part was what? Just run it by me again.
It's just the general question that if you deliver humanitarian assistance to the population as a whole, you prop up the legitimacy of the regime because there's less of a crisis.
Well, yeah, that's the dilemma of humanitarian work for the last 50, 60 years. And Afghanistan is not the first country where you could make the same statement, right? You know, I mean, and yeah, I mean, our shared humanity, and that's what it is. I mean, and this is why we do insist on the operational independence, the impartiality, and the neutrality, because it is that space to be able to do stuff when you're surrounded by things that give you bile in your stomach, you know. And if we have to get, and you know, as humanitarians, we have to get over the bile in our stomach, because then we're no good, we you know, mean, and be able to deliver on our promise of humanity.
So can we just talk specifically for a bit? If you obviously put out your appeals and your wish lists, and if you had your druthers, I mean, 23 million people facing acute food insecurity. in addition to the resumption of development aid or the delivery of humanitarian assistance, which is just the delivery of money to help you, what are the other sorts of things that you need in order to be able to address this humanitarian crisis effectively?
We come back, I mean, you can keep the foot on the pedal, to address the humanitarian crisis, but it's really about, getting people off humanitarian needs. And it's really about, coming back in Afghanistan, how do we, and it's not just about re-oxygenating or resuscitating the economy. The economy was aid dependent. So how do we move it to a different place, right? How do we move it to a more self-sufficient place? How do we create the incentives probably for the private sector, right? How do we protect some of the institutions? And it's difficult, and I want to pick up and agree with something Christina said, because when we're talking about engagement and framing it, I've had a number of problems in terms of delivering assistance over the last couple of months, and I have learned the hard way that we have very little leverage. We have very, very little leverage, and this is why I think conditioning assistance and conditionality on aid doesn't work. But I think we on the humanitarian side, we cannot lose sight of that. We need to keep the eye on the ball. We need to bring people back so that the people of Afghanistan as well can chart a way forward together. And how do we do that? How do we learn the lessons of the last 20 years and look at and do things a little bit differently? And what does that look like? Over.
I want to ask both of you now a different question, which is, let's presume we reconcile ourselves to the fact that the Taliban is the de facto government, that an effective set of humanitarian actors are going to deliver the sorts of aid they can, which is immediate and short term, but also the longer term stuff about oxygenating the economy and empowering women and trying to think about entrepreneurship and think about all the things you would do trying to create a vital economy. But this regime is still in place. And what's the end game there? I mean, what are its prospects? Is it more secure today than it was 10 months ago? And what should the international community be doing, on the one hand, to ensure that international assistance is delivered and humanitarian assistance is delivered, but to move Afghanistan back to a place that it should be in the first place, which is a locally owned, democratic Afghanistan that isn't driven by foreign interference, in which the people freely elect their own representatives, which seems awfully idealistic and wildly unrealistic, but that's something I know you both have thought about a little bit, so I'd love to hear you both on that.
I think this is a very difficult question. Where the Taliban now is different to Taliban, which was in power in the 90s, is that the Taliban now is clearly very divided. And you've got these different factions. You've got a very hardline faction, which unfortunately seems to be really dominant at the moment, and they're the ones that say we are in power because of our fighting, because of the martyrs, the suicide bombers. We fought for Islam, and our version of Islam is that girls don't go to school, women don't work, and this is what we're all about. Then you've got ones at the other end, which people often refer to as a sort of more political Taliban. They're the ones that were in Qatar negotiating, some of whom would say that, I mean, their own daughters go to school, right, in Doha, that they don't agree with those things, that they would like a different kind of Afghanistan. This is not the Taliban of the 90s. And those are the people that at the beginning kept telling us, yes, we are going to reopen schools. I was bizarrely told that the reason, in January, I was told that the reason that they were not reopening high schools for girls at the time was because they didn't have enough stationery. So I said, well, don't boys need stationery as well? But anyway. And then you've got this sort of more pragmatic group in the middle. So what some people say is because of the behavior of the international community of withholding the central bank reserves and not providing aid, that has empowered the more hardline group because they can say, you see, there's no point in dealing with the West. There's no point in doing these things like letting girls go to school because they're not going to help us anyway. I mean, it's difficult to know if that is why the hardliners are more preeminent now, but they certainly are. And so some people say, you know, this isn't sustainable, that these groups are going to end up fighting each other. There have already been reports of different senior Taliban being sidelined, of factions of different groups fighting. But, you know, there may also be an element of wishful thinking in that. Then you've got people like Ahmed Massoud and Amrullah Saleh, the former vice president, who say, you know, we have to fight and remove the Taliban. Personally, I think that the last thing Afghanistan needs is more war. And the one positive thing of the current situation is, I mean, when I have gone there recently, it's the first time in years that you can travel all around the country pretty safely. And actually, aid workers will tell you that they're able to access places where they couldn't get aid to for years. So, you know, that's a small positive compared to the overall negative situation, particularly for girls. But so, you know, that the idea that people had at the beginning that maybe the more political Taliban would be in control and that you could sort of work with them to have bring in technocrats and have a sort of representative government, that really seems now far, sadly, from happening. Some of the Taliban will say, well, it's the West's fault. You flew out 100,000 or more of the most educated people. You've done that deliberately to damage our government so that we can't continue and we can't run things. And I mean, a lot of things are not functioning. The airport in Afghanistan, you know, for now 10 months on, basically only 2 airlines fly in, 2 domestic Afghan airlines, because it doesn't meet any international standards. And the guy, I don't know unless he's changed recently, but certainly the Taliban who was running the airport had no idea how to run an airport and was apparently barely literate, so nobody could read the sort of papers of planes coming in. And so that's just one example, but there are many different organizations in Afghanistan today that don't have people running them that know anything about doing it. So that's a huge problem. And some Taliban ministers recognize that and say we need those people to come back, and any country who lost so many of its educated people would be in trouble.
So Shukria, what's your prescription for a return to more democratic rule? I mean, presumably you don't want another external invasion, but what's the plausible path to restoring Afghanistan by Afghans for Afghans?
Of course, I never was supporting any kind of invasion in my country. Never. I remember when the Russian comes during my childhood, and I remember when the US came. But it was different, of course, a huge difference between Russia and US. Before that, please repeat again the question if I forgot. I just want to say something. Is that important to think about 37 million people was been hostage. They are hostage in the hands of Taliban. What's the priority? Would you like to release them or just leave and just think about how to fill their stomach, this is also one of the challenge. The reason today we think Afghanistan is more secure to travel across the country, because the reason and the fact of insecurity was the Taliban, and they are in power now. You can travel across Afghanistan, but not women in Afghanistan. They cannot. Simply, as long as they don't have male mahram, someone, members of their family with them. That's the difference. You can maybe make a report about the situation in Afghanistan, but the Afghan journalist, local journalist, cannot. You have access to the government or de facto authority of Taliban, but not other people of Afghanistan. There are some differences we should see deep down from the perspective of Afghan people. I do respect all different opinion was being raised, but for me, my homeland, my country, is important. How we can reclaim back. Yes, of course, Taliban, just for their feet soldiers, they are claiming that's a victory and they win the war and etc. How I could believe, how you believe that within 20 years, they were not able to control one single province out of 34. But when in 20 days, they got the entire country, which kind of magic happened? Which kind of capacity and bravery they shown up? That was, power was being handed over to the Taliban. Taliban are a project, same as Mujahideen was a project, and today Daesh is a project. The Mujahideen project was been existing almost like 30 years, 3 decades. They established Kuwait in Pakistan far before the invasion of Russia, during the Cold War. And then, within 3 years, during 90s, while the Mujahideen was in power and Afghanistan was in civil war, again, the project of Taliban was being established. The 3 years old beat the 20 years old. And right now, that almost 28 years old project with the name of Taliban are being challenged with the Daesh, which is quite new. What you call it ISIS. So, which kind of Afghanistan I would dream and how we can work for that. I do believe the people of Afghanistan will find their way if we let them choose, if we let them freely go for the election, if we support and listen to their voices, if we stop proxy war in Afghanistan, if we do not support X or Y and Z, one against another, right now that land is a playground for everyone, China, Russia, Iran, Israel, US, India, Europe. Just for a second, think. In 2014, the Crimea issue, how it been solved? Russia doesn't have power to maneuver as they are doing today. Why? Because NATO and US was in Afghanistan, and they was been controlled. And today, the only Western country where let the Taliban diplomat or take over, and the Afghanistan embassy in Moscow was been handed over to the Taliban. So how close they are? They are about to give a kind of legitimacy or recognition to the Taliban. But anyway, this is how the proxy war is. The nature of third world countries, Unfortunately, it's maybe sad, it's maybe difficult to believe. We are a victim, as I say at the beginning. We don't know why we are fighting, same as Taliban. Today they don't know why they're fighting, why they are beating women on the street, why they are beating a man and women, why they are stopping girls from education. They are bringing excuses in the name of Islam, which is obviously, when this word, more than 1 billion Muslims are living, but none of them are acting as a Taliban. So the fact is, we will reach to that Afghanistan if we support and listen on a very democratic way, the people of Afghanistan. If we let down the way as it is, it's the same mistake which has happened during 90s. 9/11 happened and then they went. So things will need to be controlled one way or another way, either supporting the people, at least, for God's sake, after 10 months, the only resistant force in a very civilized way, the women of Afghanistan, every single day they're on the street, even today. While I was in a Zoom meeting, they were on the street. So they didn't get any kind of recognition. Nobody's there to amplify their voices and their messages. But for the Taliban, there's a great lobby group. I think we will reach to that. Afghanistan one day will lead by their own people independently, and particularly by the women. This is my great hope. Despite of how small, how big is the Taliban, how powerful, how bad, how brutal, they will be knocked down.
I think we should just acknowledge, I agree with you on a lot of this and on the interference, foreign interference in Afghanistan, but the Taliban took over when the government of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, and his ministers all jumped in helicopters and fled the country.
When it happened, when the Taliban was on the door of the step door of the presidential palace, because the agenda was to take over power to the Taliban. And I think soon they will come out, because I also had no idea about that one. I am the one that I'm not supporting Ghani, because they betrayed also the people of Afghanistan. If they give a signal to the people that, look, a nation, wake up, we have to hand over to the Taliban. I think that was, the people of Afghanistan had the leverage, the courage to stand. Women in Afghanistan, but no, they say it's a political process, Taliban may not enter, there will be an interim government, and they will respect, and there will be all those great lists as was been said. Taliban are a project, and they've been used. Yes, Ghani, when he's, as far as those witness people were been sitting there, we have every night space on the Twitter and etc. So people are coming and talking from their experience, and they are sharing their stories with us. So right now they say, even before they flee, the Taliban was in the door of the palace. So what was the option? Well, Ghani hand over government to them? No. Ghani also made the wrong decision, especially in the last 4 years. The second election in 2019 was the big mistake.
Okay, what I want to do is give people a chance to ask questions, because there's an interesting group of people here. So if you raise your hands, I'm going to ask that you ask questions and not make speeches, if you don't mind. And then we're also on our turn going to try and give crisp answers to be able to give you a chance. Please.
Thank you to all the speakers, and I'm also very glad to see an all-women panel, so amazing. Thank you, Conduit. I have been shocked and appalled at what I have seen as a complete lack of reckoning and doing a sort of lessons learned exercise from the international community after the Taliban takeover about what went wrong. And instead what I have seen is most of the international community doing the same projects, exactly the same work, in the same way they did for the past 20 years, now with the Taliban in charge. So I don't know if I missed something, but it seems like one should do a basic assessment of, okay, what happened? How can we do things differently moving forward? But I really haven't seen that. I would like to hear from you all if that has been done in the international community. Are there any entities that are doing that, any countries that have done that? And if not, why?
I think that's
So what
a
I
very
might
good
do,
question.
what I might do is take 3 and then we'll answer them in groups. So thank you, that's awesome.
Yeah, I have a question about the American sanctions policy. Back in, I think around, when we've started to get some news, even in the American press, about how bad things were, the humanitarian crisis, or the 23 people on the verge of starvation, there was talk of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the American sanctions bureaucracy, relaxing sanctions slightly, permitting special licenses. I guess my question is, has there been any relaxation that you can see, this is for Mary-Ellen really, in the sanctions regime as directed by the United States, despite their protestations, and did that make any difference?
Awesome, thank you. And, please, thank you.
Hi, thanks. That was really informative and quite moving. Are you worried about the impacts of climate change and exacerbating this situation in the short term, medium, or the long term? Thanks.
Okay, Mary-Ellen, do you want to take...
Mute.
You're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me just go on the sanctions one, because I can answer that one very quickly. We did get humanitarian waivers, humanitarian carve-outs. OFAC licenses is what they're called, from the US and from the UN Security Council. So that did ease up things to allow not only WFP but many organisations to be able to deliver on humanitarian assistance, and it did ease a little bit the liquidity crisis to allow us to do our work. So that did come through and made a huge difference. Afghanistan is on the front lines of climate change. I was in Wadrock just a couple of weeks before I came out, and they were telling me they've had to go 15 feet deeper this year for water, in order. There's incredible water stress, incredible deforestation. The snow cap is melting too quickly. Temperatures are too high, and you can see it right across the country. And that will exacerbate. It's having a devastating impact on agriculture. It's having, on the orchards and stuff right across Afghanistan. And this is where I think when we talk about engagement, how we move forward, these are some of the real critical issues that are impacting the people of Afghanistan that we need to keep front and center. And then quickly on the lessons learned, I think probably part of the challenges around the lessons learned is there's still a lot of pain and a lot of heartache on how things changed so quickly in Afghanistan, and that's what I'm telling myself as well. We haven't seen a whole slew of lessons learned. It's just people are still trying to process what actually happened and get beyond that. Over.
I totally agree with Mary-Ellen on that. I mean, it was the biggest humiliation to NATO in recent history, and people don't want to think about it. And I've talked to people who say that at the White House, the feeling is they would just like to remove the word Afghanistan from the dictionary. Nobody wants to talk about it. And here we had that recent, really damning, actually, parliamentary report on the evacuation and all the things that were done wrong, which was incredibly critical, and all these people from the foreign minister to the head of the foreign office, being on holiday and not coming back. But we haven't had anything beyond that. And that report, I thought, was interesting because you had military, senior military in this country, criticising the Foreign Office, and nobody has looked at, it was the military that kind of got us into this situation, and they were the ones sending these reports back for a long while that, the Afghan National or Defence Forces are able to take on the Taliban, and we've created this sustainable army, and so nobody's kind of questioned them. So I think that we really do need to have lessons learned. And actually, I mean, I've been a foreign reporter for 35 years, mostly covering conflict. One of the biggest frustrations is that you feel like you report the same mistakes being made again and again, and we don't seem to learn.
Shukria, I want to ask you the lessons learned question, but make it a narrower one, which is, you had a president who founded a not-for-profit which was about how to build effective states in fragile contexts. I mean, that was he wrote a PhD thesis literally on this question. And the entire mantra of the international community was about domestic capacity building. Trillions of dollars spent in domestic capacity building. The second that the US said we're out of Afghanistan, every single Afghan at that point said, we are not going to fight against the Taliban because they're going to win. And this entire military machine into which all these millions of, hundreds of millions of billions had been pumped, just said, here are the keys. So there was no genuine domestic capacity or state capacity built throughout this entire period. I'd love to understand why that actually didn't happen.
I do. So I do. I also want to know that. But since I was the head of defense committee in Parliament, I know how brave and courage was, and they are our army, our special force, where each single of them was being trained, same as US Marine. But yeah, lack of leadership. And those leadership where they think they're close and very dear to US 4-star general. They were leading the ministries of Afghanistan, especially the defense. And the last, before August, I would say beginning May, since everything in Afghanistan, according to, we had BSA, bilateral security agreement with the United States of America till 2024. That agreement was being ratified by the US Congress and Afghan Parliament. According to that, the US government was supplying and supporting the Afghan National Security Force. And their contractor was left everything behind 3 months before the fall of government, including the salaries. It's not about the lack of resilience or moral or capacity in the Afghan soldiers. As I mentioned, it was the order.
Order from whom? Shouldn't they just
Those whom they order, President Ghani, to hand over. And Ghani say, he will resign, say, oh, we are not asking you for resignation. That's your choice. It will may come soon as a book, probably by someone close to them or whatever. But today the same soldiers, which is you think they didn't fight against Taliban, despite of all the sacrifice they made in the last 20 years to keep US soldiers safe, NATO soldiers safe, the humanitarian workers, international and local safe, to keep the nation safe. And today we are criticizing and we are blaming them. They didn't save the country in the minute. I'm sorry. 6,000 US and NATO troop was in the airport of Kabul, probably 6 or 3,000, where less than a 50 centimeters, a half a meter, the distance between US soldier and the Talib fighter. In front of my own eyes, the Talib beat me and he was about to shoot me because I was been talking with the US soldiers on 16th of August. And that was the kind of friendship they didn't react to each other because they know scenario better than me. Sorry to say, it's hard. How Taliban militarily can come to a city where the foreign troops were there. Did you ever ask?
Sorry, what's the answer to that? I mean, I get the rhetorical question, but what's the answer for how that happened?
I think General McChrystal should come and say, because he was the one that quite often visiting the Doha. The US military should come and give the answer. I'm not the right person for that. I'm too small. I don't have enough information. I'm just sharing with you my own experience. But according to my experience, how possible? Because in 2020, when I went back home, I saw things are completely different. Because I was been sent to Norway after suicide attack on me, and they say they cannot say one individual woman because I was too loud against all bad guys, including the Taliban. They sent me, and when I came back, I found things different. I talked with some, in our government, some military generals, which is mostly young, and of course reformists, and I say, hey guys, what do you think? Because politically I'm seeing it's leaking. President Ghani is not a stable person. He's been surrounded by a very immature politician. It's the republic which is running by 3 individuals. Don't you think it's time for a white coup d'etat? Even I share my opinion with some foreigners, and they were about laughing. And I said, no, believe me, this is the only solution. This is the only solution. We will save, we will restore our achievement. But no one it was been a kind of joke. They say, oh no, you know, when foreign troops are somewhere, you cannot do these things. So
I want to try and get one more round of questions. Please.
Shukria, I thought one of the most, not most important, but the most telling things you said was that there wasn't a peace process, there was a peace project. And then I guess obviously once the foreign managers of that project changed, the project came to an end and a different project took over, the Taliban project. What is it you would like to see international actors do now beyond what the World Food Programme and others are doing to try and provide the basic humanitarian assistance that people need, especially given that, as Christina said, in places like the White House, they don't even want to hear the word Afghanistan. So what are the maybe top 3 things
we're going to do 3 questions. So, Javera.
Probably a question for Shukria. It's about the Afghans that have been evacuated here into the UK. Do you, by any chance, know the number of children that are among them? And though they're still living in hotels and haven't been housed, are they incorporated into the education system here in the UK, if you know?
And to the back, please, to Alex. Yeah, there we go.
Hi. So do you think there's exhaustion in Afghanistan from war? Because there's been war for many decades in Afghanistan. So could you put it down to the people are just tired of war and they don't see an end to it? I mean, it's a broadly open question, but it's not in the recent 30, 20 years that there's just been war in Afghanistan, but it's been for decades.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let each of our speakers do either a wrap-up comment or a response to these questions. But since we are now, Rosie is giving me the evil eye that we're over time, if you could try and keep it to a minute or 2 each. And I'm going to do Mary-Ellen, and I'm going to let you go first.
Let me take the last question as one. Yeah, when I go out and travel around the country, and I'm sure Shukira hears it from her family as well, there is exhaustion from war. You know, I mean, and what I find is so tragic that the peace dividend, after so many decades in Afghanistan, is just one, really where of economic implosion. the repression that women and young girls are seeing, you know. But at the same time, when you talk to people, the fact that there is peace, and with that peace, there is a little bit of hope that they can chart a way forward themselves. And I think it's important that we safeguard that peace when we're looking also at international engagement. Over.
Christina.
I don't know what to say. I mean, the whole thing is just so depressing, really, and heartbreaking, and it's, I mean, it's great people have come tonight because you know, we don't seem to focus on more than one thing at a time, and now everybody is focused on Ukraine, and the Taliban have obviously taken advantage of that to bring in more restrictions and think that they can just get away with it. So, and while we sit here, I mean, children are literally starving to death. People were selling their children because they have no way of feeding their families. People were selling kidneys, and you know, at the end of the day, that to me is the most important thing that we need to try and deal with, and that is an absolute emergency. And just to sort of go back to how we started this, I've never seen anywhere where so many bad things are happening at the same time. You often, as a journalist, you cover a drought or a flood or a famine, and it's terrible. But this is a famine, a drought, a climate change crisis, an economic implosion that's man-made, and a terrorist group taking over a country. And so it's hard to see where people can turn to and how you can get out of this.
Before we get to, I'm going to give Shukria the last word, which is appropriate, but I don't want a Conduit evening to end on a depressing note. So, Mary-Ellen, can you just say 2 or 3 specific things that can be done, that governments should do, messages we should send, to ways that we can be of assistance in this terrible circumstance?
I think it's keep up the advocacy and the focus on Afghanistan. Please help us with the support that we need continued for the humanitarian effort, but also help us to try and figure out the engagement going forward. We need to keep the people of Afghanistan, the 40 million people who stayed behind, that didn't leave on those planes, in our hearts and in our minds, and somehow chart a way forward that their country doesn't collapse. They don't want to see their country collapse. After 40, 50 years now, they have a little bit of peace. Let's give them the peace dividend that they deserve now.
Thank you. Shukria.
Yeah. Some children are going to school, but adopting for their family, it's, I think for everyone, staying 10 months in the hotel in a small, tiny room, it's very difficult. But still, I think they are grateful because they are survived and they are alive. So at least. When it comes to, I think, the only nation which is, you can see tiredness and fatigue on their voice, on their thoughts, is the Afghans from war. We say enough is enough, and it's really enough. Especially in the last 2 decades, the new generation grown up with the big dreams. And I feel we are responsible, I'm responsible to work for their dream to become true. No matter how dark cloud is, I do believe sun will rise again and it will shine again. I do appreciate the Marina and Christina. I admire their work in Afghanistan. I admire the way they are echoing the voice of Afghan people and the needs of Afghan people. But we do need more voices, more understanding. Regarding the process and project, international community, at least for once, I'm begging them. They should leave their differences behind and they should think it's time. With one voice, they should stand with the people of Afghanistan and they should let all the projects. Enough is enough. That's a very dirty project. It's millions of people's life was been taken away. So therefore, I would like to see the sunshine, which is bring equality and justice for my beloved country and for country in the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is a very pretty roof terrace and a sunshine up there. So if you want to continue the conversation on the 5th floor, I would urge you to trickle up there. Thank you.